Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to discover they'd been betraying you for years? Today's story will pull you into a world of secrets, power, and the kind of revenge that leaves nothing standing. It's a tale of a wife whose ambition crossed every line and a husband who turned her own world against her piece by piece. And when the truth finally came out, it destroyed everything she loved. This is one you won't want to miss. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Now, let's step into the story of her lovers betrayed her, and I used their confession to destroy everything she loved. I was grinding beans for the morning coffee when a sharp notification chimed. A friend request. A name I didn't recognize, Anthony Vega. The profile picture was ordinary. Good lighting, clean shave, a dress shirt like he just left a wedding or a wake. I almost ignored it. Then a message slid in behind the request, neat and formal, like a letter folded twice. Hello, I don't want to alarm you, but there's something important I need to discuss with you. I hope you'll give me the chance. At 56, you learn to distrust the internet's sudden urgency. I've seen every scam wearing every mask, foreign fortunes trapped in distant banks, lost parcels demanding a fee. I closed the app, poured the coffee, and told myself I wouldn't think about it again. I made it 7 hours. The second message arrived just after lunch, short and sharp enough to split a life in two. It's about your wife. My grip tightened around the mug until porcelain clicked against the counter. Rebecca was in a meeting across town. We had been married 27 years, most of them kind, some of them complicated, none of them, if you had asked me yesterday, fragile. I considered calling her. I even pulled up her contact, my thumb hovering above the green button, but something colder than fear slid into my chest. If this was nothing, I'd be paranoid for no reason. If it was something, I needed to know what kind. I wrote back instead. Who are you? He replied within minutes. An old colleague of Rebecca's. Would you meet me? I should say this face to face. No chance I was inviting a stranger to my home. I chose a public square near the old courthouse, a place where cameras watched the pigeons and the tourists, where you could hear your own heart over the fountain if you stood still. I texted a friend my location. I slipped a small piece of insurance into my jacket. Then I went. Anthony arrived 5 minutes early. He looked exactly like his photo, crisp white shirt buttoned to the throat, black shoes polished until they reflected the sky. He shook my hand with both of his like a man asking for a favor bigger than the weather. Thank you for coming, he said. I'm sorry to do this to you. Say what you came to say. He glanced at the courthouse, as if searching for a judge or absolution. I've made changes in my life. This year I found my way back to faith. Part of that means telling the truth where I've done harm. Your wife, Rebecca, was my supervisor at Marston & Co. He drew a breath that shook. For about 3 years, we had an intimate relationship. The noise of the square drained away. I saw his lips moving and heard nothing. The brain is a faithful machine until it isn't. It stalls, coughs, and comes back in fragments. Do you have proof? I asked when sound returned. He flinched. No, not the kind you can hold. It was hidden. Wrong. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking you to know. No proof. The words rang like both a reprieve and an insult. Without proof, this was either a confession or a performance. I studied his face, that careful sorrow, the starch of his collar, the way he kept his hands visible, a supplicant refusing to reach for anything. Why tell me now? Because I couldn't sleep until I did. We stood there a while, 2 men on opposite banks of a river that hadn't existed that morning. When he left, he looked lighter. I felt the opposite. I went home, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the cold coffee I'd never finished. At 5, Rebecca texted that she'd be late. Compliance review, nothing dramatic. I sent back a thumbs up I didn't mean. That night, when she fell asleep with her audiobook whispering in the dark, I lay next to her and listened to the old house breathe. I told myself I was doing this to clear Anthony from my mind, not to condemn her. I told myself a dozen decent lies and got up anyway. I started with what would be easy to explain if she woke: emails, calendar notes, the bland choreography of a busy executive's life. Nothing. Clean. Too clean. Her personal messages were a garden without weeds, the kind of tidy that only exists in magazines or after a storm. I should have stopped. Instead, I opened the laptop she used for work and found the corporate tools docked in a neat row. One of them pulsed with a blue dot, Slack. The channels were a flood of acronyms and deadlines, but the private messages, those were quieter. Names I knew from holiday parties, names I didn't. Threads archived and muted, threads that smelled like bleach. I almost missed the search bar. I don't know why I typed what I typed. Maybe it was the way Anthony had said supervisor. Maybe it was the way Rebecca had started locking her phone at dinner. I tried a word that made my throat go dry. Then another. Then a name. Messages appeared. Long ones. Late ones. The kind of flirting that only happens when people are certain nobody is watching. Plans drafted in euphemisms, refined into specifics. Photographs blurred just enough to pretend at privacy. Two names surfaced again and again, Jason Reed and Ethan Brooks, both on her team. Both men whose hands I had shaken while we laughed about appetizers at last year's gala. There's a moment between knowing and accepting when your body tries bargaining for you. Maybe this is old, maybe it's staged, maybe a hacker, maybe a joke, a role play I never consented to. The maybes came hot and useless. I took screenshots until my hands stopped shaking. I dated each file. I moved them to a drive no one but me could touch. The house ticked and settled. Beside me, Rebecca breathed like a person with nothing to fear. I stared at the ceiling and thought about 27 years' birthdays. The emergency room when Emily broke her arm, the Sunday we painted the dining room the wrong color and left it that way because it made us laugh. People don't disappear. They drift degree by degree until the shoreline is gone. At 2 in the morning, I closed the laptop. Doubt had been replaced by something harder. Not rage. Not yet. A kind of cold resolve, the kind that stacks papers in a folder and labels it carefully. I put the drive in the safe. I washed my face. I lay down again and listened to my wife sleep. In the morning, I would act. Tonight, I had learned the truth. The night after Anthony's confession, sleep felt like a foreign country I no longer had a passport to. The faint glow from the safe across the room seemed louder than my own breathing. Inside were the screenshots, Rebecca's words to Jason and Ethan, their words back to her. I'd read them twice already, but they replayed in my head anyway, like someone had tattooed them onto the inside of my eyelids. I knew 2 things. I wasn't going to confront her yet, and I wasn't going to let this rot in my head until it poisoned me. I needed a plan, something deliberate, clean, and undeniable. Revenge, if it came, would be the last step, not the first. Step 1 was preservation. I copied every file onto 2 encrypted drives. One stayed in the safe. The other went into a lockbox at the bank. I printed hard copies, too, slipping them into a folder marked with a name only I would understand. If she tried to erase anything, she'd find the digital walls rebuilt before she'd even finished packing. Step 2 was research. Marston & Co. wasn't just any investment firm. It proudly advertised its zero-tolerance policy on superior subordinate relationships. The HR page spelled it out in bullet points. Violations could lead to immediate termination. Rebecca had broken that rule at least 3 times. Documenting the dates and positions of each man she'd been involved with wasn't just a petty detail, it was ammunition. I didn't say a word to Rebecca. At breakfast, I poured her coffee, kissed her cheek, asked about her meetings. She smiled like a woman with nothing to hide. I smiled back like a man with no intention of showing his cards. Instead, I booked an appointment with Sarah Whitmore, a divorce attorney with a reputation sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't waste time on sympathy. "If you have proof, we can use it," she said, flipping through the pages I slid across her desk. "And you, Mr. Kane, have proof." Her strategy was surgical, keep the affair evidence sealed until it served a legal purpose. Leverage the workplace violations for financial advantage. Never give Rebecca the chance to regroup. "Do your daughters know?" she asked. I hesitated. Emily was 29, Chloe 26, both living in other states, both independent. But they still called every week, still sent holiday cards with little handwritten jokes in the margins. I pictured their voices changing when they spoke to me. I imagined the weight in their silences. "Not yet," I said finally. "I don't want them choosing sides before they have to." Sarah nodded. "Then we keep this between us until the moment matters." That night, Rebecca called from her office to say she'd be late, client dinner. I told her to have fun. When the line went dead, I poured a glass of bourbon, sat in my study, stared at the neat stacks of paper on my desk. This wasn't a rushed job. This was architecture, careful, measured, impossible to undo once the concrete set. The case was building, and so was I. For a week, I moved through the house like a careful ghost, present enough to keep the shape of our life intact, quiet enough not to rattle any shelves. I made breakfast, fixed the stubborn hinge on the mudroom door, asked Rebecca about her day, and listened to the clean, rehearsed answers of a person who believed we were still living in the same story as yesterday. Inside, a storm was assembling without thunder. It chose its instruments, small observations people ignore when they want to be happy. She kept her phone face down. She smiled at nothing in particular, the kind of smile you give to a message only you can see. Her perfume changed, sharper, newer, as if she was choosing a different version of herself to wear into the world. I didn't confront her. I curated the silence like a gallery. If I spoke too soon, she would retreat, erase, fortify. I needed her routine intact, the logins, the calendars, the confidence that no one was looking behind the curtains. Anthony and I spoke again, this time on a bench facing the river. Our breaths turned to pale threads in the cold. He looked less like a man seeking forgiveness and more like a man learning to live without it. "I didn't want it," he said, picking at the seam of his glove. "Not at first. She was my supervisor. She knew my schedule, my reviews, projects I wanted. She noticed me. Then she offered what looked like opportunity, dinners, late meetings, her car idling at the curb. If I pulled back, she made me feel small. If I leaned in, she rewarded me. After a while, it felt simpler to stop resisting. "Coercion," I said. The word tasted like rust. He nodded. It was also intoxicating. She was certain of herself, and certainty can feel like mercy when you're drowning. "What changed?" I asked. "Shame," he said, "and honestly, fear. She likes control. When she felt me slipping, she punished me. Smaller assignments, colder rooms. I quit before I became a roomer." A pattern sharpened in my mind. Rebecca didn't gamble with equals. She selected men below her on the org chart, then rewrote the rules around them. Charm first, leverage second, secrecy always. It wasn't romance, it was engineering. I went home and pulled the old photo boxes from the closet, not to drown in nostalgia, but to measure distance. Rebecca at Emily's 5th birthday, kneeling to tie a ribbon in her hair. At Chloe's piano recital, whispering the count under her breath while our daughter hunted middle C. In 100 frames, she was a woman intent on loving her family well. In the present tense, she was someone else entirely. The contrast ached, but it also clarified something I'd been unwilling to admit. People do not become strangers overnight. They practice. At dinner, she told me she had a strategy session early the next morning. "Quarterly planning," she said, reaching for the salt without looking at me long enough to risk seeing what lived in my eyes. "Big day," I said. "Want me to warm up the car?" She laughed. "I'm not that fragile." "Of course not." When the dishes were done, I took a legal pad to my study and began building a map. On one axis, dates, meetings, travel. On the other, names: Anthony, Jason, Ethan. In the grid between them, I marked intersections that smelled like opportunity, conferences, late-night filings, off-sites with poorly guarded calendars. The map wasn't proof, it was probability. But probability, collected in enough detail, becomes a narrative. A narrative properly arranged becomes leverage. I updated Sarah, my attorney. "We're not rushing this," she said over the phone, voice steady as a metronome. "You will be tempted to spring the trap because it feels righteous. Don't. We build, we time, we win." "Understood." "And David," she added, softer now, "be kind to yourself in the meantime. The body keeps a score the mind tries to ignore." Kindness looked like sleep, and sleep refused me, so I took smaller mercies. I ran along the river before dawn, letting the cold remind me I was still made of something solid. I cooked real meals and ate them at the table. I called Emily to ask about her new project manager. I texted Chloe a photo of the dog we used to walk past on Maple Street, the one that barked at leaves like they were burglars. I avoided turning my daughters into witnesses. They were still allowed to have an unbroken mother until the evidence insisted otherwise. Rebecca drifted through those days like someone calibrating a lie and finding it comfortable. She left earlier, returned later, scrolled in rooms she hadn't used for scrolling before. When she caught me watching, she crossed the space between us and kissed me longer than the moment required, as if affection could dissolve suspicion on contact. At night, I reviewed the screenshots until humiliation cooled into something metallic. I read her language to Jason, bold, directive, sprinkled with compliments that doubled as commands. I read Ethan's replies, careful, grateful, as if he were composing thank you notes to a storm. I cataloged details that would matter later, hotel names, timestamps, the joke about quarterly performance reviews that would play badly in any boardroom. On Thursday, Anthony sent me a short message. "I'm ready to do the right thing at work if you need me to." He didn't say report. He didn't have to. I told him not yet. A premature alarm would only wake the castle. Silence is an art form. It asks for discipline, a steady hand, and a willingness to be misunderstood by the person you eat breakfast with. It also asks you to decide what kind of man you want to be when the quiet breaks. I wrote that question at the bottom of my legal pad and underlined it twice. The next morning, Rebecca stood in the foyer with her laptop bag, radiant in the winter light that poured into our hallway and made everything look forgiven. "Don't wait up," she said lightly. "If it runs late, I might crash at the hotel near the office." "The Copley?" I asked, too casually. She blinked, recalculating. "Maybe we'll see what they comp." I smiled, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. "Have a good day." When the door closed, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The house felt newly hollow, as if the air had been moved out to make room for truth. I slid the folder of evidence back into the safe, turned the wheel, and listened to the tumblers settle. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number Sarah had given me, someone who could pull ghosts out of deleted files and teach them how to testify. Not yet, I told myself, but soon. The storm was nearly arranged. All it needed was weather. The law office sat in a converted brownstone near Beacon Hill, mahogany doors, brass fixtures, the kind of building that whispered money without ever raising its voice. I had chosen Sarah Whitmore for a reason. In Boston's divorce circles, her name wasn't spoken casually. It was delivered like a warning. She specialized in infidelity cases, and her reputation had been built on precision, not mercy. She greeted me in a navy suit that looked as though it had been pressed directly onto her frame. Her voice carried the clarity of someone who wasted no one's time. "You told my assistant you have proof," she said, sliding a legal pad between us. "I do." I set the folder on her desk. Inside were printed transcripts of Slack messages, photographs, and names. Anthony Vega, Jason Reed, Ethan Brooks, each neatly labeled with positions and reporting lines at Marston & Co. Sarah paged through them without a flicker of emotion. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, but her words were blades. "Mr. Kane, this isn't just adultery. This is a textbook violation of workplace policy, multiple instances over multiple years. That's leverage." "Leverage for what?" "For a favorable settlement, for keeping your house, for avoiding alimony. If we can prove she exploited her position for these relationships, it weakens her credibility and strengthens your claim to a disproportionate share of the assets." She began sketching the plan on her pad, each point numbered with the precision of a surgeon's incision. Evidence consolidation. Keep digital and hard copies in secure, separate locations. Witness cultivation. Approach potential witnesses quietly, prioritizing those still inside the company. Financial audit. Track all joint accounts for unusual withdrawals or transfers. Flag anything that smells like asset concealment. Timing, no confrontation until we're ready to file. Surprises are most effective when they leave the other side no room to maneuver. Sarah leaned back, tapping her pen against the pad. The moment you tell her what you know, she'll start erasing, moving money, and spinning her story. Our job is to keep her comfortable until the rug is ready to be pulled from under her. It was clinical, almost cold, but I needed that. I had been living in the heat of betrayal for weeks. Sarah's approach was ice and ice preserves. "What about my daughters?" I asked. "Emily and Chloe, they're grown, but..." She didn't let me finish. "They don't need to know, not yet. Let them keep their relationship with their mother intact until the case is filed. After that, the facts will speak for themselves." I thought about Sunday calls with Emily, her voice bright as she told me about her new apartment in Denver, about Chloe's texts filled with travel photos from Seattle. I imagined both voices going flat. I imagined their warmth turning cautious. "No slip-ups," Sarah said. "This only works if she believes the marriage is intact until the moment it isn't." When I left her office, the cold air on Cambridge Street felt cleaner than the air inside my house had in weeks. In my coat pocket was Sarah's card and a retainer agreement. And in my chest, for the first time since Anthony Vega had typed those 4 words, "It's about your wife," was a clear sense of direction. That night, Rebecca came home late again. She kissed my cheek, hung her coat, poured herself a glass of wine. I asked about her day. She gave me a sanitized version, boardroom meetings, client calls. I nodded, matching her performance beat for beat. Later in the study behind a locked door, I opened a fresh notebook and began logging every movement, every excuse, every name that passed her lips. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was preparation. And Sarah Whitmore was waiting for the day we'd turn preparation into execution. The consultant's name was Lucas Hart. He worked out of a one-room office above a locksmith in South Boston, the kind of place you'd never find unless someone like Sarah gave you the address. Lucas shook my hand, sat me down, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he clicked his pen and spoke in a voice as neutral as a lab report. "I do corporate incident response. Deleted does not always mean gone, especially not in enterprise environments. We set the rules. No accessing anything without proper authorization. No touching company servers. No shortcuts that could compromise admissibility in court." He asked for the hardware Rebecca used at home, anything she'd synced locally, and any credentials I could lawfully provide. I brought him the work laptop she often left charging in the kitchen. I logged the transfer time, the condition of the machine, and the serial number. "Chain of custody," Lucas said. "Judges like that phrase." He imaged the drive while I watched, a progress bar crawling across the screen like a slow truth. Then came the archaeology, carving unallocated space, reconstructing fragments, indexing caches most users didn't know existed. As the night thinned, a shape began to emerge from the noise, Slack artifacts, email headers, preview thumbnails the system had generated and forgotten to fully erase. "Look here," Lucas said, tapping the screen. "Slack desktop caches message history differently than the cloud. If you know where to look, you can see deleted snippets, at least the parts that were rendered locally. Snippets became threads. Threads became conversations. Jason Reed's avatar blinked awake in the logs. Ethan Brooks's did too. Dates lined up perfectly with the strategy sessions on Rebecca's calendar. The tone was unmistakable, witty, hungry, bolder every time Rebecca steered. Lucas exported everything to a review platform. We read the messages in a sterile interface designed to strip drama from the dramatic. It didn't succeed. There were late-night exchanges that began with deadlines and drifted into compliments. Plans to decompress at hotels a short walk from the office. Photographs, careful, cropped, suggestive. Then came the sentences that changed the gravity in the room. To Jason, "I like knowing I can close my hand and you will be there. That is our arrangement. When I need you, you show up." To Ethan, newer, more cautious, "Trust is simple. I hold the line, you follow. Your work improves. Your review reflects that. Transactional, predatory. The kind of language that would read like a confession in any HR office in America." My jaw tightened until my molars ached. Lucas didn't look at me, he just kept cataloging identifiers, message ID, timestamps, IP addresses that placed the logins inside Marston and Co.'s network. Email was worse because it wore a suit. Rebecca marked certain invites as optional for the men she favored, then booked follow-ups in private conference rooms tucked away from the main floor's glass. When they were off-site, she wrote from a personal account, brevity that made intent obvious. One message read, "Same hotel as last time, same floor, use the service elevator." I asked Lucas if this would hold up. He nodded. "We'll hash these exports, maintain audit logs. If opposing counsel questions authenticity, we'll point to the metadata. And if they demand context, you have plenty of that too." I took breaks, not because I wanted to, but because my body demanded it. I walked the hallway, touched the framed photographs, trying to remember what the living room had felt like before it turned into an evidence locker. Then I came back, sat down, and kept reading. Sometimes her tone softened, not out of affection, but efficiency. To Jason, "I like how focused you are after. You're sharper when you've been seen." It made my skin crawl because it was deliberate, because it worked, because I could see Anthony's warnings etched into her language. Lucas found a folder most people forget exists, a local sink where temporary files go to die slowly. In it, auto-saved drafts of emails Rebecca had half-written and abandoned, like a thief rehearsing a route. One read, "You should minimize written contact for a while. Use Slack. Use your personal phone. Leave the office first." She never sent it. She didn't have to. The men replied in exactly the way she wanted elsewhere. We built a binder from the fragments. Section tabs with names, subtabs with dates and locations. At the front, a synopsis written in plain language, supervisor, subordinate, repeated instances, duration, internal policy at issue, likely witnesses. It was ugly. It was clean. It was indisputable enough to make me feel both sick and vindicated. "Backups?" I asked. "If she claims fabrication, Marston and Co. almost certainly runs routine snapshots," Lucas said. "If HR opens an inquiry, they'll pull server-side logs. What we have here gets you to that moment." He handed me a portable drive. We generated a checksum and printed it on a certification page. We both signed it. He kept a mirror copy in his safe. I put mine in the bank lockbox with the rest. On the drive home, the Charles River lay black and still, the city's reflection stretched thin across it. I parked, sat in the quiet car, and realized I was no longer guessing. Guessing is frantic. Knowing is colder. It has edges. It cuts. At home, I poured water instead of bourbon. I stood at the sink while the dishwasher hummed and the clock in the hall counted out the kind of seconds that make a life. Rebecca texted, staying late, pushing a proposal over the finish line. I replied, "Proud of you." Then I put my phone face down and let the lie sit there, humming beside hers. The next morning, Lucas emailed a concise summary for Sarah. I forwarded it with a single line. "We are ready when you are." I'd expected relief to come with that send button, some lightness for having crossed a threshold. Instead, the air felt heavier, as if the house knew we had moved from suspicion to indictment. There was nothing left to recover. Only what came next. I didn't need them on my side yet. I just needed them not on hers. That was the strategy: move early, speak softly, and plant enough doubt to take root before truth arrived with teeth. Rebecca's father, William Hart, lived in a narrow colonial in Quincy, the kind of house that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and furniture polish. He had always treated me like a son, even when I was just the kid borrowing his daughter's car and returning it half full. On Saturday, I drove down with a tin of his favorite shortbread and no agenda written on my face. He opened the door before I could knock twice. "David," he said warmly, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" "Thought I'd check in," I said. "Been too long." We settled into the front room where the afternoon sun laid a pale hand across the rug. He poured tea. We talked about the Bruins, about the stubborn leak he'd finally fixed in the upstairs bath. Then, when the conversation was comfortable, I let a single thread loose. "Rebecca's been putting in long hours," I said casually. "Strategy season, I guess." He grunted, the sound fathers make when they dislike a situation they can't fix with a wrench. "That girl's never known how to slow down. She's been different lately." I let the word hang small and non-committal. New perfume, new routines, more nights at the office. I looked out the window, as if the street might understand me better than he would. I'm probably reading into nothing. Marriage does that sometimes. William set his cup down and studied me over the rim of his glasses. You've never been one to fuss over nothing, he said quietly. Is there something I should know? I shook my head, enough conviction to look honest, enough hesitation to invite concern. If there is, I'd like to understand it before I start naming it. He nodded slowly, cataloging the difference between panic and prudence. If you need anything, you come to me first. We're family. Family. The word landed with weight. I changed the subject to the garden, to the way the lilacs had failed last spring and come back meaner this year. When I left, he hugged me a beat longer than usual. Doubt had been planted, and doubt, tended properly, becomes a shield. Next was her brother, Michael, 3 years younger than Rebecca, quicker to laugh and quicker to anger. We met at a Southie bar with good wings and televisions big enough to erase conversation. He shoved my shoulder when he walked in. Look at you, he said. You get better looking, or did I get worse eyes? Both, I said. We ordered a pitcher, pretended to care about the 4th inning. You talk to your sister much these days? I asked. Not enough. She's busy being important. Then he squinted. Why? She's intense lately. I shrugged, as if complaining about the weather. New habits, new schedule. Feels like she's chasing something that isn't chasing her back. Michael snorted. That's Rebecca. She hunts, always has. Sure. I let a pause open, an invitation disguised as silence. Sometimes the hunt changes the hunter. He turned from the screen to me. You two fighting? Not really, just taking notes. I smiled. Maybe I'm getting old. He leaned in, elbows on the sticky table. If something's off, I want to know. She doesn't get to bulldoze the people who actually love her. There it was, not loyalty to me, but a willingness to doubt her if doubt became necessary. When we stood to leave, Michael clapped my back like he was promising backup I hadn't asked for. At home, the pictures on the mantel looked like evidence from a different decade: Emily's missing front tooth, Chloe's graduation cap at a tilt, Rebecca laughing at something outside the frame. I could feel the cruelty of what was coming. Not the reveal itself, that would be justice. The collateral: families don't break clean, splinters travel. That night, Rebecca breezed in late, cheeks bright with winter wind and the thrill of a problem solved. We finally locked the portfolio model, she said, kicking off her heels. You should have seen Jason's face when we landed the pitch. Jason. She said his name like a colleague's, not like a secret. A good lie always contains some truth. Sounds like a win, I said. It was. She poured water, looked at me over the rim of the glass. You're quiet. Tired. She brushed her fingers across my shoulder, affectionate, practiced, strategic. Don't wait up, tomorrow might run late too. When she went upstairs, I messaged Sarah that the family groundwork had begun. Careful, she wrote back. Imply, don't accuse. We need them anchored, not inflamed. I'm threading the needle, I replied. Sunday, I called Emily. We talked about her new manager who wore cowboy boots with suits and said, circle back, unironically. I asked if Chloe was eating well, which made her laugh. I didn't say the words I was holding. I let them live in a version of the world where their parents were simply busy. It felt like lying. It was also mercy. I drove back to Quincy with fresh bagels. William opened the door wearing an expression that told me he'd been waiting at the window. He poured coffee without asking. David, he said, if my daughter is hurting you, I need you to say so. I kept my eyes on the steam rising from the cup. If your daughter is hurting our family, I'll do what I can to minimize the damage before I involve anyone else, including you. He exhaled a long, tired breath made of resignation and love. You're a good man. Don't let that make you a foolish one. I won't. On the way out, he squeezed my forearm. It wasn't permission. It was preparedness, the posture of a father bracing for a call he hoped would never come. Back in the car, I could feel the map in my head redraw itself. Allies here, uncertainties there, neutral ground in between. I wasn't stacking a jury. I was making sure that when the verdict arrived, it wouldn't be drowned out by noise. That evening, Michael texted, if she's lying to you, I'll help you make it right. I stared at the sentence until the screen dimmed. Help is a funny word. In the wrong hands, it becomes gasoline. I needed water. When Rebecca went to bed, I stood in the doorway and watched the shape of her in the low light. I remembered our vows, not the words, but the reckless certainty I'd felt saying them. People change. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they stay and still leave. I turned out the hall light. The house settled, Wood remembering the cold. In 2 days, the call would come that gathered her family on one screen. And in 2 days, the seeds I had planted would recognize the weather. I didn't need them to judge her. I needed them to believe me. When I showed them why they must not stand in my way, the meeting invite went out with the blandest subject line I could think of. Family check-in. I set it for 7 p.m. A neutral hour ambiguous enough to mean anything from birthday wishes to bad news. Rebecca accepted within 5 minutes. William, her father, replied with a thumbs-up emoji he'd learned last Thanksgiving. Michael wrote, "I'll be there." 2 cousins and an aunt, one who had always liked me more than was strictly polite, rounded out the list. I left Emily and Chloe off, not because they were children, but because I wanted to spare them the theater. If they learned, they'd learn later without the chorus. At 6:59, the grid filled my laptop screen, faces in small squares, each lit by a different understanding of what evenings are for. Rebecca logged in from her home office, a wall of tasteful degrees behind her like a jury already convinced. Her lipstick was careful, smile the one she wore to negotiations. "What's this about?" she asked, easy as breath. "Housekeeping," I said. "Won't take long." William leaned toward his camera. "You two all right?" "We're fine, Dad," Rebecca said quickly. "Just busy." I let the quiet spread until everyone could hear their own breathing. Then I opened my notebook, not for me, but so they could see I had brought the kind of order bad men rarely bother with. "I'm going to say 3 names," I told her, "and then I'm going to ask a simple question." I watched her pupils tighten, a black coin tossed into a dark well. Anthony Vega, Jason Reed, Ethan Brooks, Rebecca, do those names ring a bell? The room went still. Somewhere a cousin's television murmured about the weather, suddenly obscene in its normalcy. Rebecca's mouth made a shape without sound. She blinked, found a script, and tried to read from it. "They are colleagues. Anthony used to be. Jason and Ethan are on my team. Why are you?" "On your team," I echoed. "Good, so you remember the org chart." Her eyes hardened. "David, if this is some kind of ambush." "It is exactly that," I said, "because the truth has a history of being postponed when it's invited gently." Michael shifted the way men do when a bar fight starts 3 seconds earlier than they expected. "Rebecca, what's he talking about?" "Nothing," she snapped. "David is confused." "I'm not." I clicked share screen. The first slide wasn't the worst. It was the simplest, a policy page from Marston and Co. Highlighted in yellow, rules on superior subordinate relationships, the consequences, the reasons. I let them read it. I let them understand the rules before I showed them the violations. Click. Slack transcripts, names in the left margin, timestamps on the right. Messages in between that began professionally and ended with hunger disguised as productivity. Compliments sharpened into propositions. Propositions matured into logistics. A late-night joke about quarterly performance reviews, the kind that would make any compliance officer cancel lunch. Rebecca's face lost its color pixel by pixel. Her trackpad twitched toward leave meeting. "Don't," I said, soft enough to be frightening. "You need to hear this the way I had to read it." William's voice came through, older than I'd ever heard it. "Becca," she froze. Click. A hotel confirmation, the Copley, 10:14 p.m., same floor. A chain of personal emails to Jason, short, ruthless. Use the service elevator. A message to Ethan, the new one, the careful one. Trust is simple. I hold the line. You follow. Your work improves. Your review reflects that. Michael swore. The aunt muted herself and didn't realize she hadn't. Her whispered prayer spilled into the call. "Stop," Rebecca whispered. "Please." 3 years, Rebecca, at least. Anthony first, then Jason, then Ethan. The pattern isn't subtle. Men who report to you chosen because their yes was cheaper than your no. She shook her head. "You went through my devices. You invaded my privacy. This is abuse." "The word you're looking for is evidence," I said. And the word I'm looking for is coercion. She gave a brittle laugh. Coercion, don't be dramatic. Anthony's square wasn't in the grid. He didn't need to be, his words already were. Click. Her language to Jason appeared on screen. I like knowing I can close my hand and you will be there. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. William took off his glasses as if they were the reason his eyes hurt. Tell me this is fake, he said. Tell me, Becca. Rebecca's jaw trembled, then locked. It's complicated. Michael barked a humorless laugh. That means yes. It means, Rebecca said, voice rising, that marriage is not a prison, that adults make choices, and that David has chosen to humiliate me in front of my family because he's vindictive and... Because you lied, I said, because you weaponized your position at work and your secrecy at home, because you let me carry a history that wasn't ours while you wrote a new one in private. I stopped sharing so they could see faces instead of text. The effect was worse. In the absence of words, expressions sharpened. William, grief and disbelief locked in a slow, ugly dance. Michael, anger looking for a door. The cousins, curiosity collapsing into judgment. Rebecca, small for the first time in years, stripped of narrative. I'm filing, I said, and felt the sentence land like a signature. This week, lawyer retained, evidence preserved. I wanted you to hear it now because when papers are served, stories get told and I will not be the villain in hers. William lifted his hand, then let it fall. What happens next? Nothing loud, not yet. There will be no scenes, no theatrics. There will be a process and there will be an end. David, don't do this here. Rebecca said, please, we can talk, just us. No, I said gently. We did that for years, apparently. We'll do something different now. She looked into her camera like it was an exit, then closed her eyes. When she opened them, the competence was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally run out of rooms to stand in. I'm sorry, she whispered, to the grid, to the house, to the part of herself that had once been better. I never meant to hurt. You meant to get what you wanted, I said. And you did, until now. I shared my screen one last time, a simple timeline, dates aligned with business trips, promotions, performance reviews, arrows where the personal intersected the professional. When the slide ended, there was no climax left to chase. William's voice cut through. Becca, you need to leave the call now. I need to speak to David alone. Dad, now. Rebecca hovered, then clicked. Her square went black. Michael leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching the camera. Tell me what you need. I need you not to interfere, I said. Not to comfort her into a story where I'm the problem and she's the weather. Let the facts do their work. William wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. I raised a daughter to be strong. I didn't raise her to be unkind. I'm sorry, David. Me too, I said, and meant it with a sincerity so heavy it bent the sentence as it left my mouth. When the call ended, the house was very quiet. Upstairs, a door clicked, a small sound that told me Rebecca had heard enough of other people hearing her. I didn't follow. Tonight had been about staging. The room was arranged. The witnesses were seated. The truth had entered and found no empty chairs. The call ended with a silence so heavy, it felt like gravity had shifted. One by one, the squares on the screen went black, first William, then Michael, then the cousins. Rebecca's camera froze for half a second before vanishing, as if even the internet couldn't bear to witness the wreckage. I sat there for a moment, staring at my own reflection in the glassy laptop screen. My face looked older, calmer, colder, the kind of calm you only earn after walking through fire and deciding not to scream. I closed the lid, stood up. On the hall table was the manila envelope, the divorce papers already signed on my end, clipped neatly with Sarah's card tucked inside. Sarah had told me I could use a process server. I told her I'd rather deliver them myself. Some endings shouldn't be outsourced. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already there. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I saw her pacing in the kitchen, phone in hand, hair pulled back the way she always did when she was rattled. I stepped inside without announcing myself. She turned when she heard the door, relief flashing across her face, relief that died the moment she saw what I was holding. David, please, can we talk about this? Her voice trembled, but still carried that edge of control, the tone of someone who'd negotiated her way out of worse situations. "We're past talking," I said. My voice was steady, the way you hold a level so the line stays true. I placed the envelope on the counter between us. "You need to leave tonight." Her eyes widened. "Tonight, David, this is my home too." "Was your home," I corrected. "Now it's mine, and you can afford a hotel." She stepped closer, hands open in a gesture that might have been surrender or manipulation. "I know I've hurt you, but please, just give me a chance to explain." "Explain what?" I cut in. "That you lied to me, that you lied to your family, that you risked our marriage for office flings and thrill-seeking." She flinched at that last word, thrill, as if it had found a way under her skin. I slid the envelope toward her. "This isn't a debate, Rebecca. This is a decision, mine." Her hand hovered above the papers but didn't touch them. Her shoulders began to shake. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd married, the one who danced barefoot in the kitchen at midnight, who laughed so hard at a bad joke she cried. And then the image dissolved. What remained was the woman who had chosen Jason and Ethan and Anthony over me. "Over us," she whispered. "After everything we've built." I almost laughed. "We didn't build it. I did. You just lived in it." The tears came fast after that. She turned away, leaning against the counter as if it might hold her up. "Please, David, don't do this tonight." I picked up her overnight bag from the chair, already packed from the night before when she'd been working late. I set it on the floor beside her feet. "It's already done." For a long beat, neither of us moved. The refrigerator hummed. A clock somewhere ticked too loud. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing against wet pavement. Finally, she straightened, wiped her face, picked up the bag, no words, just the sound of the zipper catching for a moment before closing. She walked to the door, heels tapping like a metronome marking the end of something. At the threshold, she paused. "You'll regret this." I met her eyes. "No, you will." She left without slamming the door. Rebecca never did anything undignified, but the emptiness she left behind was louder than any crash. I stood there for a moment, feeling the strange collision of triumph and grief. This was the justice I'd planned, the line I'd been waiting to draw. And yet the victory felt hollow, like standing on a mountaintop only to realize the view didn't change who you are. Upstairs, the bed was still unmade from that morning. I sat on my side, hands resting on my knees, letting the quiet seep in. For the first time in decades, the house was mine alone. It didn't feel like freedom yet, but it was the first step. For 2 weeks after Rebecca left, I tried to hold the line. Emily didn't need to know. Chloe didn't need to know. Not yet. Emily was buried in her first year of residency in Chicago, running on caffeine and adrenaline. Chloe had just started a new marketing job in Seattle, learning the ropes, finding her place. I told myself they deserved the grace of ignorance, that their lives were busy enough without inheriting the mess their mother had made. But secrets have a half-life, and mine was already starting to decay. It came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray New England day where the clouds sat so low they looked ready to scrape the rooftops. I was halfway through fixing a loose cabinet hinge when my phone lit up with Chloe's name. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered, ready to hear about her latest project. "Is it true, Dad?" Her voice was sharper than usual, not angry, but bracing for impact. I could have played dumb. I could have asked, "What do you mean?" or pretended the connection was bad, but my daughters didn't inherit their mother's gift for performance. They got my stubborn instinct to cut through the noise. "Who told you?" I asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "Uncle Mark, he didn't give details, but enough to know something's happened. Emily called me right after." My stomach tightened. Mark, Rebecca's younger brother, was someone I'd counted on my side. Apparently, loyalty bends under the weight of family drama. I sat at the kitchen table, the hinge still lying on the counter, half repaired. "Your mother made choices that hurt us all," I said carefully. The words felt like they'd been weighed on a scale, just enough truth to honor their right to know, not so much that it would poison their love. Chloe was quiet for a moment. "So it's true. It's complicated," I offered. "No, Dad, it's actually not. I can hear it in your voice. I wish you'd told us yourself." That one landed like a punch, because she was right. In trying to protect them, I'd given someone else the power to frame the story first. I didn't want you to have to choose sides, I said, and I didn't want you to see your mother differently before you had to. Well, too late for that. We didn't hang up angry, but we didn't hang up whole either. The call ended with a brittle "I love you" from both sides, the kind where you hope the words can hold more than they actually do. Later that evening, Emily called. She skipped the warm-up. "Dad, I know Mom's involved with people from her office. I don't know how deep it goes, and I don't want to, but I need to know, are you okay?" It was the first time since this began that anyone had asked me that. A lump rose in my throat. "I'm okay," I lied. Emily exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath. "I'm coming home next month, just for a weekend. Chloe wants to come too. We don't want to take sides, but we want to see you." I told her I'd like that. I didn't tell her that by then the divorce would already be in motion, the lawyers sharpening their pens. After I hung up, I stood in the living room looking at the framed photos on the mantel, the four of us at the Cape, Chloe's high school graduation, Emily in her white coat. Moments that used to feel like proof of something unbreakable. Now, they looked like exhibits in a trial no one had agreed to join. Keeping them out of it had been my first instinct. But as I stared at those smiles frozen in time, I realized the truth was already bleeding through the cracks. And my next move might be the one that decided whether they'd ever forgive either of us. By the third week after the public reveal, Rebecca was no longer the unshakable executive who could silence a boardroom with a glance. Word had traveled faster than even I anticipated, weaving through family circles, corporate corridors, and the social clubs where we'd once been the power couple. She began making her moves, carefully worded calls to relatives, carefully staged coffee meetings with co-workers, a quiet PR campaign designed to rebuild what she'd lost. I knew the strategy, reframe the narrative before it calcified into something permanent. But this time, her audience wasn't buying it. Her father hadn't returned a single call since the video confrontation. Michael, her younger brother, still spoke to her, but with the weary tone of someone tired of being used as a messenger. At the company, colleagues who once sought her approval now offered brittle, polite smiles and avoided her in the elevator. It wasn't morality that had shifted, it was instinct. People know when someone is vulnerable. Meanwhile, Anthony Vega kept texting me. At first, his messages were hesitant, as if unsure whether his involvement had painted a target on his back. When I replied without hostility, his tone relaxed. "She's been asking me to talk to the partners," he told me in one call, voice low, as if someone might be listening. "She wants them to know she's the victim of a smear campaign." I almost laughed at the irony. She's really going with that? She's desperate, but Jason and Ethan aren't saying a word. They're pretending they barely know her now. That told me everything I needed. Silence in this game was self-preservation. Jason Reed and Ethan Brooks had every reason to keep their heads down. Too much noise could cost them their jobs. Anthony was different. He had already confessed, already taken a moral risk by contacting me. That made him valuable. I started thinking of him less as a guilty party and more as a fuse, small, fragile, capable of triggering something far bigger if lit at the right moment. "Anthony," I said, choosing my words like placing a chess piece, "you ever think about how this looks to the partners? Not the gossip, just the facts. A senior executive having relationships with subordinates. That's not just frowned upon, it's a policy violation." He was silent for a beat. "They already know some of it." "Not all of it," I countered. I didn't push further, not yet. If I showed my hand too soon, I might spook him into retreat. But in my mind, the picture was forming. Anthony could be the inside voice the company couldn't ignore, the one who'd give the investigation direction. And I could make sure it pointed straight at Rebecca's corner office. The trick would be timing. Too soon, and she might recover enough political capital to survive. Too late, and the trail would cool. Rebecca was trying to gather allies. I was building a different kind of coalition, silent, invisible, and entirely committed to ending her reign where she worked. And as much as I hated to admit it, I found myself almost enjoying the precision of it. Because in marriage, Rebecca had always believed she was the better strategist. In this end game, I intended to prove her wrong. Anthony didn't agree right away. For days, our calls circled the subject without touching it directly. He'd drop hints about how toxic the office atmosphere had become. I'd ask careful questions about company policy. Then we'd drift into safer topics. It was a dance, hesitation, and inevitability trading steps. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night. Anthony called, his voice tight. "She cornered me today, asked why I've been distant, said she needs people who will vouch for her integrity." I let the silence hang long enough for him to feel the weight of it. "Anthony, you don't owe her that. If you stay quiet, you're letting her keep doing it to others." "That's easy for you to say," he muttered. "You're not the one who has to face her in the office." "No," I said, "but I am the one who's seen the evidence, and so will the board if you give them the chance." I didn't unload everything at once. Instead, I fed him the most damning pieces from my file, Slack transcripts where she bragged about keeping him in line, calendar invites disguised as budget review meetings, hotel receipts charged to the company card, every breadcrumb chosen to spark outrage, not pity. Then I aimed the real shot. "Anthony, you've already admitted she pressured you when she was your boss. Marston and Co.'s policy is crystal clear, no relationships between superiors and subordinates. Ever. You think HR will look the other way when the board sees proof. This isn't just about you anymore, it's about the company's liability." That word liability landed. He went quiet for a long time. "If I do this, I need to do it right." "I'll help you," I said. "But it has to be airtight. Dates, names, documents, and you're not going to mention me. This has to look like it came from you alone." Over the next week, we built the report together. Anthony handled the narrative, how it began, the pressure he felt, the way it blurred professional boundaries. I provided the architecture, a folder of screenshots, email excerpts, and chat logs, all sorted chronologically and cross-referenced. For good measure, I slipped in 2 more names, Jason Reed and Ethan Brooks, each with enough digital breadcrumbs to lead HR straight to their doors. When the report was ready, Anthony sent it directly to the board of directors and copied the compliance officer. No middle management, no HR filter to bury it quietly. Straight to the top. 2 days later, the first ripple hit. Rebecca's calendar was suddenly cleared of external meetings. The board convened an emergency session late on a Friday. By Monday morning, word had spread. An internal investigation was underway targeting possible misconduct by senior leadership. Rebecca must have known exactly where it came from, but she couldn't touch me, not without looking like she was retaliating against a spouse in the middle of a divorce. Instead, she turned inward, trying to sniff out the betrayal inside her own ranks. What she didn't realize was that the betrayal wasn't just one person, it was a chain reaction. Set in motion the moment Anthony pressed send, and I was holding the match that lit the fuse. The investigation moved faster than I dared to hope. Within 48 hours of Anthony's report hitting the board's inbox, Marston and Co. brought in an outside compliance firm, a clear sign they wanted a clean, independent paper trail for whatever was coming. By midweek, the whispers started. A friend in accounting texted me just one line. "She's off the calendar." In corporate language, that meant her meetings were quietly reassigned, her authority redistributed so her absence wouldn't paralyze operations. In human terms, she was already halfway out the door. Friday morning it happened. Rebecca was called into a closed-door meeting with the CEO and the head of compliance. She emerged 40 minutes later, pale, jaw tight, clutching a thin manila envelope. She didn't make eye contact with anyone as she crossed the open-plan floor toward the elevators. By lunchtime, the company-wide email went out. Effective immediately, Rebecca Kane is placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation into possible violations of company policy. All inquiries are to be directed to the compliance department. No further details. None were needed. In an office where gossip was practically a second language, the blanks filled themselves in fast. Jason Reed didn't even make it to the weekend. His termination was for cause, the polite way of saying they'd caught him in something they couldn't ignore. I later learned they'd confronted him with Slack transcripts and hotel receipts from work trips. He didn't fight it, probably knew there was no winning. Ethan Brooks, on the other hand, kept his job, technically. Anthony's testimony, backed by his saved messages, showed that Rebecca had pursued him relentlessly, not the other way around. HR didn't want to risk a wrongful termination claim on top of the scandal already brewing. Still, keeping his job didn't mean keeping his reputation. In a high-stakes finance firm, proximity to scandal is a stain that never washes out. I doubted Ethan would last another year before voluntarily resigning. For me, it was a strange kind of satisfaction. Not joy, never joy. It was the grim confirmation that the pieces I'd set in motion were landing exactly where I wanted. I hadn't lifted a single finger inside that building. But my influence was everywhere, in the panic-tightened faces, in the whispered hallway conversations, in the locked office doors. Rebecca had always thrived on control of her image, of her subordinates, of the narrative itself. Now that control was gone, stripped away not by chance but by precision. And the best part, I still had cards left to play. The board didn't waste time. 3 weeks after the investigation began, the verdict arrived, not with a dramatic press conference or a public spectacle, but with clinical efficiency that cut deeper than any performance. Rebecca was summoned to headquarters on a Monday morning. She must have known. The writing had been on the wall since her suspension. The security guard waiting in the lobby wasn't a formality at Marston & Co. It was a ritual. His presence told every passing employee that this meeting would not end with "welcome back." Inside the boardroom, the decision was presented without theatrics. Following the findings of the independent investigation, Marston & Co. has determined that you violated company policy regarding relationships between supervisors and subordinates. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. No elaboration. No mention of the chat logs, the hotel receipts, testimonies. They didn't need to. The paperwork was already prepared, severance minimal, benefits ending at the close of the month. When she walked out, 2 members of security flanked her as she collected the personal items she'd left behind after the suspension. No one made eye contact. A few glanced up from their screens, but most simply stared harder at their work, as if invisibility was safer than recognition. I didn't hear from her that day, not directly, but the ripples reached me within hours, calls from mutual acquaintances asking if I'd heard the news, emails from extended family pretending to be shocked. Even Anthony sent a 2-word text. "It's done." The loss of her job hit harder than I think even she had anticipated. Rebecca had built her identity on being the untouchable executive, the one who could walk into any room and own it. Now, stripped of title, income, and the professional network she'd cultivated for decades, she was adrift. Financially, it was a nosedive. The bonuses, the stock options, the expense account, all gone. Her lifestyle, built on a high 6-figure salary, was suddenly unsustainable. She had savings, yes, but the divorce proceedings were already draining them. Socially, it was worse. Friends from the corporate world stopped returning her calls. Even the family members who'd once defended her had gone quiet since the video call reveal. She'd gone from power player to cautionary tale almost overnight. For me, the news wasn't cause for celebration. It was confirmation. Every step I'd taken had led to this moment, and it had landed exactly where I wanted it to. A clean, irrefutable conclusion that she'd done this to herself. Rebecca Kane had lost the marriage, the family's trust, and now the career that had been her fortress. And I was standing on the other side of the rubble, holding the blueprints for her downfall. The divorce settlement came through on a rainy Thursday morning. Sarah called me just after 9 a.m. Her voice had that quiet satisfaction lawyers get when the paperwork reads exactly the way they planned it. "It's final, David. You keep the house, both cars, and your entire retirement account. No alimony, no spousal support, no claim to your business. It's clean." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just let the words settle like stones dropping into still water. Rebecca had fought. She'd tried to argue for compensation for the years she claimed she'd supported my business. Sarah dismantled that argument piece by piece, emails showing she'd withdrawn from our joint savings for personal trips, financial records proving my company had never taken a cent from her salary. In the end, her position had been reduced to a single, unshakable fact. She had more to lose in court than I did. When the settlement was signed, she walked out without looking at me. Her lawyer gathered the papers, thanked Sarah stiffly, and left. I stood there for a while after they were gone, staring at the empty chair where she'd been. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? No more legal ties, no more financial chains. The house, the business, the future, all mine. And yet, victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like the end of a long, grueling war where the silence afterward is almost too loud. The fallout for Rebecca had been total. The career was gone. The network had evaporated. The money shrinking fast. Even her closest friends had stepped back, unwilling to get caught in the undertow of her reputation. For me, life began to move again. Slowly. I had the freedom to remodel the house without her approval. I could take business trips without wondering who was texting her while I was gone. I could sleep in my own bed without the weight of suspicion pressing on my chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was stability. And stability, after years of chaos, was worth more than revenge ever could be. That night, I opened a bottle of scotch I'd been saving for when it's over. I poured one glass, sat on the back porch, and listened to the rain hit the deck. Somewhere inside me, the war was finally winding down. Rebecca might rebuild her life someday. She might find another career, another circle of friends, another man to believe her stories. But she would do it without my resources, without my name, and without the shield I'd unknowingly given her for years. The victory wasn't loud. It wasn't a scene for the history books. It was a line on a legal document, a signature at the bottom of the page, and the knowledge that I had walked away, with everything that mattered still in my hands. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, I noticed something unusual. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It was different from the silence that had filled the house when Rebecca was still here, the kind of silence that carried suspicion in its corners. Now the quiet felt clean. It was the sound of space waiting to be filled. I started small. Morning runs along the river. Coffee at the cafe down the street where the barista learned my name. An overdue trip to the dentist. Things I'd put off for years because I'd been too busy managing a marriage built on cracks. Friends began pulling me back into the world. A poker night here, a dinner invitation there. At first, I made excuses, old habits die hard. But gradually, I started saying yes. Travel was next. I booked a hiking trip in Montana, something Rebecca had always called pointless suffering. It turned out to be the most alive I'd felt in years, waking up in the cold air, seeing the sun spill over the mountains. It reminded me there were still places untouched by the mess we'd made of our lives. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch with a book, the sky melting from orange to deep blue. I'd catch myself smiling for no reason at all. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about what Rebecca had lost. It was about what I'd found again, the ability to breathe without waiting for the next blow. I stayed in touch with Emily and Chloe. Our calls were warmer now, less guarded. When they visited, the house felt lighter, as if they could sense the change too. We didn't dwell on the past. We didn't need to. One afternoon, Chloe looked around the living room and said almost to herself, "It's peaceful here." It was such a simple comment, but I felt it land deep, a quiet confirmation that I'd managed to protect them from the worst of it. I know I'll never be the man I was before all this happened, but I'm not sure I want to be. The man I am now understands the weight of trust and the cost of losing it. He understands the value of a life built on truth, even if that truth is hard-won. As summer approached, I made a decision, no more looking back. The war was over. The battlefield cleared, the horizon ahead mine to choose. I didn't know exactly where I was going next. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. Some journeys don't need a destination. They just need you to start walking, and that's where this story ends. Rebecca lost her marriage, her family's trust, and the career she had built her life around. Her betrayal didn't just cost her everything, it showed that ambition without integrity eventually collapses on itself. What would you do if you were in David's place? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. This has been Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.